And Tony, the US president has voiced concern about possible terror attacks amid this chaotic situation in Afghanistan. Does that surprise you when there is a power vacuum, considering you had Libya, classic example, Libya. Does that surprise you when the US president says that?
Well, look, we're hearing loads of things on the Western press about how terrible it is the Taliban have taken over. I think it looks to me as if the bigger problem is going to be what we've just been hearing, the problems with resources, food and things like that, to actually keep the people alive, rather than the Taliban creating terror attacks. The big crisis, of course, has been the disastrous attempt by the West to put in its puppet government over the last 20 years. And one of the big products of all of that, of course, has been the poppy, the opium poppy, which has absolutely exploded in production, with these poppies being guarded by NATO troops. And so that has been one, I think, of the main objects of actually being in Afghanistan. Nothing to do with helping women's rights or whatever. In fact, WikiLeaks produced a document from the Central Intelligence Agency proving that women's rights were nothing to do with what they really wanted, but this was a convenient cover in the Western press. I mean, we've seen very little proper analysis of what's really been going on anywhere in the press here. Mostly just the usual fear porn, fear mongering about poor Western occupation collaborators being rounded up, etc. But the Taliban have said that they're going to give this universal amnesty. I think most people, and I know Afghans here in Bristol, they don't trust the Taliban, but they trusted NATO even less. This was a mafia government that we installed, totally corrupt. It was never regarded as legitimate, representing Afghan interests by the Afghans themselves. And I suppose it's the lesser of two evils. They think, well, maybe the Taliban will do a little bit better. We've had Lord Alderdice here from the House of Lords, and also the author and former EU advisor, Lucy Morgan-Edwards, making some fascinating insights into what this was really all about. And the other important key thing is that it certainly looks as if the Taliban and the Mujahideen before them were a kind of puppet put there by Brzezinski and the Central Intelligence Agency way back in the 1980s. And the idea that, oh, they've gone rogue and now the Taliban are independent, I don't think that's the case. We've had the CIA brokering this deal, Zalmay Khalilzad, who's from the State Department. I don't think that Joe Biden, the president, has had anything to do with this. This is a deal that's been done by Blinken, and Biden has had nothing to do with it at all. It's all above his head.
Stay with me, Tony. I've got something important to discuss with you on that. Sarah, Tony raises a very important point about the importance of getting food to the Afghans, making sure that their livelihoods are not disrupted. How important is that, in your opinion, that to avoid a civil war or violence or a disruption to the country, so that the country can live on and avoid any more further bloodshed?
Well, it's absolutely essential, because already a majority of the population lives absolutely on the razor edge. They don't know where food is coming from tomorrow. And by intentionally cutting off all money, freezing all assets, as the U.S. predicts in all of its business news articles, this will immediately create hyperinflation. Food prices will skyrocket, literally in days. And what was inaccessible to many people will become totally inaccessible. So here you have a calculated maneuver by Washington to cut off every possible source of food, what's more important than that? And to send the economy consciously into a free fall. Now, that is a level of cynicism. This whole war has been corrupt, but that really is mass terror. And that's what sanctions are meant to do. They are intended to demoralize the population, divide, and have everyone seeking just to figure out how they're going to eat tomorrow.
Okay.
So This is really a criminal act, and the U.S. doing it, and doing it intentionally.
Right.
Announcing they're doing it, sending a warning, that creates great apprehension, doing it also through the IMF, through the World Bank, through the UN agencies. It's not just their own banks. It's every financial institution right now has put the squeeze on Afghanistan and cut off everything.
Tony, we've heard over the past several days from the US's allies in Europe. For example, the German president said that the scenes that we're seeing shames the West. And we also heard today, over the past 24 hours, from a former UK Prime Minister, which will remain, don't need to bring up his name, who says that the situation and the nature of the withdrawal puts the West's power in decline. What do you make of that?
Well, of course the West is in decline, most definitely. I think this is one of the reasons that we've got all the economic tensions with China, etc. It's because the West has just lost its economic clout. The Chinese are producing stuff better and cheaper, and slowly but surely China is rising as a world power, not through military means, but simply by economic means. But look, the Taliban, who are these people? Where have they come from? They have been financed through Saudi Arabia. Obviously, anything that the Saudis finance, we have to look on with extreme suspicion. You remember, of course, bin Laden, who they supposedly went to try and find in a cave in Afghanistan back in 2001, if anyone believes that anymore, after the September the 11th attacks. Of course, he was the Saudi involved in financing them at the time. But I think also you may see the sacking of the British Foreign Secretary Dominic Raab, because
right.
I've seen over here they're trying to use this crisis as an excuse to get him, because if you remember, he spoke out against the use of a destroyer in Crimea a couple of months ago, and he was saying, well, we shouldn't be doing this sort of thing. This is actually doing bad things for Britain in the world. Well, of course, the real masters in charge don't care if Britain looks bad, so they may be using this as an excuse also to try and sack the British Foreign Secretary. At the end of the day, though, you're absolutely right. The West's power is waning, and this is a very clear example of how overstretch can happen. The other thing, of course, is all these troops coming home. We have to be concerned that maybe a wider war may start. They may be bringing these homes because they're planning something bigger. And of course, in Afghanistan, they would have been totally isolated. So they're swapping an overt intervention and force for the Taliban, which many people see around the world. I'm not totally sure about it, but it certainly looks as if the Taliban may simply be a Saudi, US, British covert force.
Right. We'll have to see about how things unfold. Last word to Sarah. Sarah, do you want to chip in with exactly what 1 or 2 minutes we have left? What was the nature of this, the whole 20 years of the occupation? On one side, you hear Biden said we weren't there for the reconstruction. On one hand, you had the Congress set up a watchdog that was for 10 years about the whole basis of the watchdog was for the reconstruction of Afghanistan. What were they in there for?
Well, of course, they were in there primarily for enormous multi-billion dollars in profit to oil corporations, to military corporations, to politicians, to generals, to the warlords in Afghanistan. That profit drove it. But it was also about having a strategic foothold in Central Asia on the borders of both China and Russia. And the U.S. thinking was having a whole number of bases and military forces in Afghanistan. They were in a position to threaten China and Russia. It turned out not so well for them. They've been unable to defeat the poorest country in the world. There was resistance nonstop of every form. We don't know what is ahead of us, but we do know that the U.S. is in decline, and yet they are going forward right now with aggressive new war plans against China. And China is not the poorest country in the world or the most underdeveloped. It's highly developed. Its very existence is a threat to the U.S. on many levels.
Right.
The U.S. also continues to threaten Iran, and that was another big reason that they were in Afghanistan, that they felt they were positioning themselves against all their enemies, and instead they're not unable to hold that position. So the decay is real. The positioning and loss of it is real, but still, they don't plan to leave Afghanistan alone. They want to starve it down, even worse conditions than Afghans are facing right now. And that is what we absolutely have to.
Let me thank our guests for their contribution and time. I'm afraid we have run out of time. Sarah Flounders is the co-director at the International Action Center, joining us from New York. Tony Gosling, as always, thank you very much. Investigative journalist, joining us from the British city of Bristol. And that brings an end to this edition of the News Review.